It's not even about the Nobel Prize. I think what they can hope for is a good career. The Nobel Prize is a bit like a lottery. You can't base your life on these awards. I'll tell you the real problem. No country can survive without investing in fundamental science. There's an argument, why don't you let the West do fundamental science and we'll exploit the discoveries? It doesn't work that way. If you don't have the scientific base, you won't even be able to know which discoveries are worth translating.
With these interventions, one of the concepts we talk about is this whole idea of morbidity compression, which is that you can improve your lifespan so that the time you suffer or be declining can be just few years.
I think some people get obsessed with longevity. I've heard that among the upper middle class and wealthy people in India, it has also become an obsession.
I won't disagree with you at all. I think there is a lot of interest. Venki, welcome to Sparks. In preparation for this podcast, I have gone through both of your books last 1 week, and I really enjoyed. I read the first book, Gene Machine, about 4 or 5 years ago as well. I remember thoroughly enjoying it, but it was super fun to go through it again. And I was going through both the books, especially Gene Machine. I was reminded of the fact, Venki, that you grew up in India, in Vadodara, and initially, I think you were, for a variety of reasons, you did not go to top universities in India or even abroad in the early part of your career, but that has not stopped you from doing really pioneering work, which is, you have really moved the biology, forward, rewarded with Nobel Prize, which is one of, many accomplishments in your impressive resume. But I want to start with, your late teenage years, early 20s. The fact that, both your parents were scientists and, quite accomplished in their own right. And the fact that you did not start with the, top Ivy League, colleges. Was there some, self-doubt or you were okay? You knew that you will do quality work and you like sciences and it will all work out in the end?
I don't think I thought too much about it. I think I made some bad decisions and some of it is because I was given bad advice, I would say, by my especially my dad, although he would say, he said, it doesn't matter where you go, as long as you work hard, you'll do fine. I don't think that's true at all, although because my career has worked out, he would say that he was right. Okay. Yeah. But that actually worked out. There was a lot of luck and other things involved. And going to a very good place minimizes it changes the equation between luck and opportunity, okay? Because you simply have more opportunities and you're less dependent on some unusual lucky break. And I graduated from high school when I was 15, and I won a National Science Talent Scholarship. And in fact, I was admitted to very good. In those days, you had to do basic science. You couldn't do engineering or medicine with that scholarship. And that was fine. But I got into very good colleges in Delhi and in what used to be Madras, but now Chennai. And my parents, though, were reluctant to send me away because I was too young, and they thought, I might sort of get into trouble and so on. Anyway, so that was one thing. Then I went to Ohio University. Again, many Indian students do their masters in India. I could have gone to one of the IITs for a master's in physics or something. And but they, I got this opportunity to go to Ohio University. And my dad basically said, "Oh, yeah, that's fine. If you work hard, you'll be fine." Of course, I went to Ohio, and the professors there are very good. I mean, many of them went to top universities. The students were not so great, because they're people who probably didn't get into the better schools. And the reason that I went there is because I was only 19. I had not taken the GRE. And so it was the only school that would give me a fellowship. So I went there and I kind of, I did okay for a while. Then I sort of lost interest in physics. and or at least in what I was doing, and then decided to switch to biology. And that's when I think my career started to change in the direction that I took later.
And absolutely, that transition from physics to biology, I think, started that whole different trajectory, and enabled you to
and to
make
do
all these
that, I had to
contributions.
go back to graduate school.
Right.
I didn't want to do a postdoc because I didn't know very much biology. So I went back to graduate school and was even taking undergraduate courses while I already had a PhD. And here I was, sitting in a class, but I wasn't too much older than them. By then I was 24. Many of them were about, in their 20, about 20 or so. So I wasn't really that much older. But it was an interesting experience.
It must be fun, casually you're taking classes, maybe doing some, coursework together, and then you casually mention, oh, by the way, I already have PhD
in physics. They all thought it was unfair, But,
that's right. Yeah, the reason, I'm starting on there, Venki, is also, I think a lot of younger people will be listening to this podcast. And I, in my work, I come across a lot of, people in their 20s. Yes. And they all feel like, if they've not gone to the best college, they've not done great work or started a company, your career is kind of already over. And in 20s, you were really navigating, you made a lot of changes. You went back, and completely to a totally different field. Yeah. Just, how do you look back, and what advice will you give to younger people to navigate?
So I will tell you, I did take 2 nationwide exams. One was the IIT entrance exam, and one was for the Christian Medical College in Vellore. And of course, I didn't prepare particularly for these exams. I now realize, many of the people who do well, they've gone to extensive coaching classes, which are really directed towards taking this exam. My parents didn't believe in any of that, and I didn't particularly care. So I sort of walked in cold and took, and these exam questions are a little odd. They're really meant to trip you up or test your sort of some particular skill. And so of course I didn't do very well at all. I didn't get into any of them, but I did do the science talent exam, and that I think was really designed to test more, I would say, more straightforward kind of thinking as well as knowledge. It was a different kind of exam from the IIT entrance exam, which seemed to me kind of tricky rather than, and you had to somehow understand that thing. Maybe they've changed it now. And of course, it could just be that I'm not as smart as, I think some of these people who go to the IITs are extremely smart. And so it could just be as simple as that.
People might have believed you, many decades ago, but no one will agree to that anymore.
No. I think accomplishment and being smart are two different things. You can be somebody who's not quite as smart, but for various reasons have managed to have a good career and accomplish something. And that's due to a lot of other things, persistence, having resources, having patience, being open to ideas. I think there are a lot of other qualities besides, what I would call raw intelligence or smartness.
Right. So I guess, a lot of IIT aspirants in India who don't get in, I think they can keep solace in the fact that, they can still do their, hard work over decades and eventually maybe even win a Nobel Prize,
it's not even about the Nobel Prize. I think what they can hope for is a good career, a satisfying career where their abilities are rewarded. That's what really we want. The Nobel Prize is a bit like a lottery. If you happen to, be lucky enough to do something important and of the level that they consider worthwhile, and then you have to be one of the areas that they pick, and then you have to be one of the 3 people they pick. So there's a lot of ifs there, right? So you can't base your life on these awards, but I think you can say, I'm going to do something interesting with my life and have something that's rewarding.
No, absolutely. And, I mean, given that, Venki, you are very few people of Indian origin to ever get the prize. And I understand, career and science is way more than the prize. But I'll come back to, your work on ribosomes. Reading about it is very fascinating. I'll park, for a little later. But, you, at the age of 23, you already had your PhD in physics. And then you switched, and you started studying biology. In, a couple of years, you really ramped up and you started as a postdoc in biology. So kind of you're starting to commit yourself into career in science, and maybe the fact that your parents were scientists might have also influenced. But that that interest in sciences and commitment to sciences, how did that manifest for you?
I think part of it was simply that I had committed myself to a career in science, and I found myself not so interested in physics, but I found that biology was going through a very exciting phase, and maybe there was real opportunity there to do interesting work. And so I switched to biology. But even after that, after my postdoc, I should say, at Yale, which was a very good university, I applied to 50 universities for a faculty job. I didn't even get an interview, okay, let alone a job. And then I got this sort of, a short job, a 1-year job actually at a national lab. And then I moved to a different national lab, Brookhaven National Lab, where I was able to launch my career. But things didn't look like they were going to work out even after my postdoc. And then when I was doing my initial research at Brookhaven, I was wedded to a technique that didn't really have a lot of potential. It was called small angle neutron scattering. And it's still used, but it's a niche technique. It's not a mainstream technique in biology. And the information that you get is not usually not very, it's not terribly useful in most cases. Occasionally it can answer a specific question. And so even at the end of that, I found, well, maybe I'm stuck with this dead end technique and I don't know what else to do with it. And maybe I could have kept publishing some papers, but I'm not sure I would have really made some important contribution to some area of biology. And that required, again, going away on sabbatical to learn a new technique. So I would say what I did was, instead of dropping off the map and doing something else, I tried to keep myself in the game by either changing fields or changing techniques or even moving institutions. If I found a particular institution wasn't quite the environment or that I wanted to be in, I was not worried about changing institutions. I think those are all, that kind of openness is what helped me. But I have to tell you that I was never sure it was going to work out. So I always had a plan B or C. Plan B, you might be amused by it, was to become a computer programmer, because in the late 70s, it was still, now every high school student knows how to program, okay? But in the late 70s, it was still a skill. It was a marketable skill. And so I thought, well, maybe I could, some of my friends went to Silicon Valley and, some of them became quite rich. And so, I could have done that. The other thing I thought of was being a high school science teacher. Now, of course, I had applied to colleges and they'd all rejected me. But I thought if I lowered my sights to becoming a high school teacher, that would have been okay, and it would still have been a very interesting and valuable profession, because you're influencing the future generation of scientists and you're doing a lot of good for society. So I always had these backup plans if things didn't work out.
And while you were navigating this, I guess in your late 20s, you did not get the interviews for those faculty positions and this, technique, which was probably maybe at some point you realized it's going to be a dead end or very small. But how was your mental state at the time? You had this plan B and C. Were you like, this confident person that it will work out in the end. I know in some way what I want to do.
It wasn't quite like that. If I'd been really confident, I might not have a plan B or C, right? So I was clearly worried, but I think what it was I sort of said, well, this is what I have to do now, and if it doesn't work out, then I'll worry about it. Okay, but things usually did work out, and I think it worked out for a combination of things. I would say, I mean, a lot of it was luck. But some of it was simply judgment. I think judgment is something that's undervalued. But we're always making judgments every single day of our lives. We're making judgments. Should I do this or that? And so I think it's that, maybe I made enough good judgment calls that it worked out.
And you were able to put a strong foot forward every day, irrespective of the outcome. Somebody's
No. There were times when I was depressed. There were times when I was worried. I think being married to my wife also helped because she's very grounded, and she would make sure that I spent time with the family, and we would go off on walks or holidays and so on. I think having that balance in your life meant that you're not fretting about your problems all the time, but rather you have some balance. You're doing other things that you enjoy that take you away from your worries and so on.
Right. And throughout this period, but your joy for science was getting stronger. You were reading, exploring.
It comes and goes. Sometimes it just feels like a job. There are other times when it's exciting. I think it's not like every single day is some hugely exciting thing. But there is always the feeling that you're working on something unknown, something that you're trying to figure out. And that's different from many jobs where you're simply doing something very, very routine and it's highly predictable. So in a way, science and research is really different from that.
Yeah. At this point, I want to ask you, about this career in science. Today, India, we're an interesting juncture. Venki, I know you've done some work with ISC, in the later years, you visited a few times and so on. Today, still, I feel, top students, don't choose a career in sciences. A lot of there obviously engineering and medical college, and there's still a lot of programming jobs, and GPT takes over those.
Well, that was true in my time too. The National Science Talent Scholarship, oddly enough, attracted some really smart people. One of them, Ramesh Narayan, is a professor at Harvard. He's a very famous astronomer. His father was G.N. Ramachandran, who was a very famous Indian biophysicist. So it did attract some really top people. But by and large, people did go into engineering or medicine, even in my time. In fact, I got into medical school. And then when I got this scholarship, I went to the faculty office and said, I want to change my admission from pre-medical to a BSc course in physics. And there was just stunned silence in the office. Nobody could believe that a guy was giving up a seat in medical school to go do a bachelor's in physics. And I think that was true then in 1966 or 67. And so I think, nothing much has changed. And this has to do with the economics. People, and especially in India, parents are big, influence. Okay, they have an unusual amount of power compared to the West. And so, they're concerned about their kids' earning potential and then it all goes into other things like marriageability and all sorts of social things, right? And so they push their kids into things that they think are economically going to pan out. And that's why there's this mad rush to get into these sort of areas.
But people in their teenage years, also fascinated by science and big questions of life and understanding the world and so on. You think there's somewhere trade-off, people in terms of the economic potential versus just intellectual pursuit, and making the choice somewhere at least in early 20s that what is the primary vector on which you want to commit your career?
Absolutely. I think it's true. I don't want to minimize. I mean, I think engineering or medicine are also very intellectually very rewarding because you're solving interesting problems and so on. Unfortunately, many of these people go to IITs. They don't even become engineers; they become corporate executives. And that's a different story altogether. And maybe they think that's I think India, frankly, could use more engineers to build infrastructure and facilities and so on. And I'm not sure you need that many, uh, you know, uh, such a large fraction of your brain power going to corporate executives. But in any case, uh, I think there's still a large number of Indians who are going to basic science who are very smart. I mean, we see them here. Many of them come here to go to graduate school or to do postdocs. So it's not, it's not completely, nobody's doing it. But I know what you mean. There is this fascination early on in life, and then later on they make choices that they think are pragmatic, based on job prospects and earning potential and things like that.
Yeah, maybe Venki, I mean, through these questions, I think making my inner term will play out. I think in a different life, I would have loved to have a career in sciences. My daughter has just started her physics undergrad program, so at least she is for now quite interested in
And
sciences.
where is that?
She is studying at Caltech, so just finished first year, going to start second year.
That's one of the top physics programs in the world. So
yes, she is very lucky. I'm very proud, and also learning some physics through her now, even late in the life. But no, I also believe, I think India needs to do much better job of encouraging people and creating those opportunities and environments for people to pursue, sciences. We're part of, we are very proud in India. The economy is doing very well. We are looking at a lot of growth and so on. But in some way, big enabler of that, fundamental research also plays a huge role. As a country,
it is a huge role. And the problem, I'll tell you the real problem, no country can survive without investing in fundamental science. And the reason for that is very simple. Even if you're not, there's an argument, why don't you let the West do fundamental science and we'll exploit the discoveries? It doesn't work that way because, as economists know, there are these things called first mover advantage and agglomeration effects, which is a big discovery made in the Bay Area or in Boston or in Cambridge, UK. Who's going to know about it first? Not the applied scientists and engineers in India. They're going to be the people who are going to translate it right here and start a company right here, or in the Bay Area or Boston or places like that. And so, if you don't have the scientific base, you won't even be able to know which discoveries are worth, translating into a product or into an application. So you do need a local base of highly trained basic researchers in every field, so that you have that edge and you're able to make the most. Even if you're interested in industry and applications, you still need that base.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I hope in the coming decades we should see that change. I think there's some work that being done on National Research Foundation. And so on.
I thought the foundation of ICERs in India, that was a very good move. And I believe it was CNR Rao who really was a moving force behind establishing those as a kind of equivalent of the IITs, but for basic science and research, and also for education. So I think that was actually a very good idea.
And I'm aware of them. There are a lot of people think about this seriously. Probably, hopefully, maybe there is a bit of a movement. Starts over. If all these things takes time, but hopefully, I'm optimist that in the coming decades we should see a lot more of that. But coming back to now your early research career, so I think very early on you found out you got involved in one of the labs with the ribosome work, and I think what I found very inspiring, going through your book Gene Machine. At some point, you felt you had to make a choice. You can do easy, safe problems, or you can go after the hard problem. Which is somewhere you felt that time has come. The ribosome, that 30S structure will get solved, and you decide to kind of go all in and just 100% dedicated yourself to that, which was a big academic risk in many ways. You had to, I think, move continent also to be able to pursue that?
Yeah, I tried. It was risky because I didn't know whether it could be done. There were groups. There was this very well-known group led by Ada Jonat, who had initially worked with Wittmann, who was a German scientist, but then he died in 1991. And then she continued that work in Germany, and she was very, very well funded. She had, was associated really with 2 or 3 institutions, one in Israel and 2 operations in Germany, supported by the Max Planck. And so they had crystals for a long time, but it wasn't clear that it was going to be solved. And so to go into that and also competing with this very well-established group did take a kind of leap of faith, and it was a risk. But one way I tried to minimize the risk was by moving to the LMB, where I'm talking to you now, which is the Laboratory of Molecular Biology funded by the Medical Research Council. So it's called the MRC Lab of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, but we call it the LMB. And the reason for that is it has stable funding, and it has a tradition of supporting very long-term problems. So I felt that as long as I was working hard and actually making progress, they would probably not pull the rug out from under me in terms of funding. So that's how I tried to minimize my risk. But, it did involve other things. For example, I had to move, and my children were grown up and they were in the US. And so my wife and I had to move away to a different continent. And I took a large pay cut, almost a factor of 2 in pay cut to come and work here. So it involved other compromises. But then you have to ask, what do you want out of life? And, even with a factor of 2, I'm still in the top 1% in terms of worldwide, income. So it's not like, I lack things in my life that I want. So I just felt it was worth doing.
Yeah. So at that point, you were not hedging anymore. This was a large unsolved problem, very important for biology. And you somewhere, I guess, had a hunch, or you felt that time is right. It is going to get solved. It's a matter of time. And you felt that you're probably in a unique position to give it a good run.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I would say my physics background probably helped me a little bit there, because I did some calculations of what sort of signal to noise could I expect from different scenarios, and would it be good enough? And I think that's what helped me feel like this is a doable problem now, whereas before it might not have been doable.
So Venki, going a little bit into science of the work you did and my layman understanding. So ribosome are these tiny structures inside the cell, which basically help
they're tiny in everyday terms, but they're actually enormous in molecular terms. So the human ribosome has almost 500,000 atoms. And there's a model of the ribosome behind me over there. You can, next to my bicycle helmet. And it just shows you how complex this machine is. And what's shown there, I can just bring it for you 1 minute.
Sure.
So you can see what's shown here is the large subunit here and the small subunit here. And in between are these tRNA molecules. You can see one in red and one in green here, and then one in sort of a brown color here. And what this molecule does is it reads genetic information. Now, genetic information is present in our DNA, but it's not directly reading it off DNA. It's reading it off a copy of DNA called mRNA. Now, mRNA was unknown about 4 years ago until the COVID pandemic came along, and then everybody heard about these mRNA vaccines. And, the people who some of the people who made it possible went on to win the Nobel Prize. There are many other aspects to mRNA vaccines, but the Nobel Committee recognized only one specific aspect to it. But anyway, mRNA is a copy of DNA, and it's that copy that essentially is threaded between these two subunits. So this little white thing here represents the mRNA strand, which is like a thread, and it comes out at the other end. And so that's being read, and the code on that mRNA is being read. And so it's reading the code along the mRNA and making the protein in the other subunit, in the blue part of the ribosome. And the protein, as it's made, comes out and folds up and into a functional protein. Now, we have thousands of genes, and every gene, one of these genes contains, not everyone, so there is other genes which only code for RNA and don't code for proteins, but many of them are protein coding genes. And those genes contain information on how to make the protein, what order of amino acids to string together to make the protein. And all our thousands of proteins are made exactly in that way by the ribosome. In fact, while we've been talking, thousands of proteins are being made in each of your cells by the thousands of ribosomes in them. So that's the process. And it's very fundamental to biology because it's proteins that carry out the function, but it's genes that contain the information. So it's the bridge between the information, which you can think of as a sort of blueprint or a recipe, and the product. Okay. And so you can think of the ribosome as the factory that makes the proteins using the genetic blueprint.
Right, got it. And as I understand it, this was known from at least from 60s, if not before that. The role of ribosomes,
they were discovered in the 50s, actually, in the late 50s. Right. And then by the 60s and 70s, a lot was known about what the ribosome did and even which parts were involved. But what wasn't known was how it did it. And to do that, to really understand that, you needed to know what it looked like. And that was the big goal, is to solve its atomic structure.
Right. And maybe can you talk a little bit about this? So what did it involve? You had these crystals and you used this in X-ray crystallography.
So normally when you want to look at something small, you use a magnifying lens. And if it's very small, you use a microscope. Okay. But there's a law in physics which says that you can't resolve two objects that are closer together than half the wavelength of the light you're using. Now, the distance between atoms is 0.1 nanometers, that is 0.1 billionth of a meter. And the distance, the wavelength of light is 500 nanometers. So it's already about 4 orders of magnitude off, right? So the way to do that is to use radiation of the appropriate wavelength, which are X-rays. And because there are no good lenses for X-rays, the way to do that is to produce crystals of your object. And this is easy if any school child knows how to make crystals of salt or sugar. You simply make a solution and let it evaporate, and it'll form crystals. But if you want to make crystals of a very complicated object like the ribosome, it's very tricky. And this was something that Ada Jonath first did with Wittmann, working in Berlin in 1980. And these crystals then are hit with a beam of X-rays, and the scattered X-rays are preferentially scattered along certain directions. This has to do with interfering between the regular arrays of the molecules. And by measuring that scattered radiation, you can computationally do what a lens does and reconstruct an image of the object. And that then allows you to look at the structure of the ribosome and determine where all the atoms are in the ribosome. So that's a sort of layperson's view of crystallography. I should tell you that in the last 10 years or so, or actually over a dozen years now, a different technique has come along called cryo-electron microscopy. Electron microscopy always existed, but electrons are highly damaging. And so the old ways of using film meant that by the time you got enough signal, you damaged your object, and also the objects had moved in the electron beam.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't get high resolution images, but now you can. And so today, nobody would solve the ribosome using crystallography. They would use cryo-electron microscopy, and you could actually do it in a week or two, as opposed to this long-term project. And so certainly, instead of getting a Nobel Prize for solving the structure of the ribosome, today it would be a kind of what we call a rotation project. When people come into your lab and want to do a small project as an intern, you would give them a ribosome sample to solve by electron microscopy. So, but that's science, things change.
That's science, that's amazing. Yeah. This is things which were very difficult 2 decades ago as a routine. I guess, same, I guess, applies to the cost of genome sequencing. It was such a big project in the 90s, right? And today it's,
and in fact, a lot of that is due to a colleague of mine in Cambridge, also of Indian origin, Shankar Balasubramanian.
Right.
He's one of the inventors of next-gen sequencing, which is what brought the cost of sequencing down by orders of magnitude.
Right. And I think the revolution from just very fast, ultra fast mapping of genomes probably, I guess, ahead of us. Maybe a little bit later, I'll pick your brain on that. Just last story on I was riveted reading your book about Venki. So you were in the race with 3-4 groups, and you had to get this time from this, I think, that access to the beam to be able to, I guess, take images of the crystals, and you have to wait for 6 months with 48-hour window. Almost sounds like a Bollywood movie, you have that shot. Otherwise, you have to wait for a while, and someone else might, get there first.
I had lost, I think. So I wrote to him in October, and our beam time was in March. So that's October, November, December, January, February, at least 5 months. Okay, and it was about 5 months of wait in a period when we were in an intense competition with these other groups. So that was extremely stressful, I would say.
Yeah.
And also a bit of drama. That's why I wrote the book. I thought it would be kind of interesting.
Right. Yeah, I highly recommend people reading that book, and I guess those 48 hours also didn't go exactly as a plan. I think everyone was working around the
that's
clock.
right.
And
if that 48 hours had not worked out, then we would have been scooped. It was as bad as that. So...
Right. So everything from, commitment to science to prolonged dedicated work to some...
But it also required a lot of planning. I had a graduate student who's now, by the way, a professor where your daughter is studying at Caltech.
Oh, okay.
He's also a National Academy member, Bill Clemens. That guy, did what we would call as a kind of preliminary mission. He went to a different synchrotron where he tested out these crystals over a 24-hour period to make sure that when we did the final experiment, they would be actually working. So I think we did an enormous amount of preparation to make sure that 48 hours would not fail.
Right. And despite there was a little bit of drama during the 48 hours, but at some point you were able to obtain the images. You knew you were onto something, and you really got the results you're looking for, right? And you were at some point, I think it was you or your team, you were dancing around the room as well, I guess.
That's right.
Really finally had it. So was it and after you started sharing the findings from that, was it was instantly obvious to everyone that you guys have gotten there first, and it's obviously a very big deal because it's a
well, there were 2 or 3 structures that came out around the same time, and so but everybody realized it was, and we were one of the people who contributed, and our structure of the 30S turned out to be the more complete and accurate one that ended up being used. And so we got a lot of credit for it, and everybody felt that this was a major breakthrough in the field. So, we'd start getting invited to all sorts of conferences and to talk about it. And it started leading to things. For example, a couple of years later, I was elected a fellow of the Royal Society. And then a year after that, I was made a member of the National Academy of Sciences. So there was a general feeling in the science community that this was an important piece of work.
Yeah, looks like most of the science community, because in one of your interviews, I was also like quite amused by the, we have heard of, Watson of, DNA fame, kind of going out of his way a couple of times to tell you to forget about, trip to Stockholm without you even asking for his opinion.
Jim Watson shoots his mouth off all the time. It's got him into big trouble. And it's why, he's basically been canceled, which is a sad thing because he's one of the great molecular biologists of the century, I would say. And one of the really great biologists, I would compare him to somebody like Darwin in some ways. But the fact is, he has these weird views and characteristics. But the fact is that he shoots his mouth off. And of course, he tells you, one thing about him is he's telling you exactly what he's thinking without any filter. Other people might think the same, but not actually tell you. And so I don't actually mind. I was slightly amused by it, because actually the first time he said it, this whole Nobel thing was not really on my mind, and it just came out of the blue from Watson's mouth. And, but it made me think that, people are thinking this is a Nobel-worthy discovery. And then by the time he told me it to me the second time, it was like 9 years later. And by that time, I had pretty much given up on the idea that I would be one of the three people. And so it didn't bother me too much. I have a somewhat thick skin when it comes to Watson. So I'm used to his...
Yeah, but that's, I guess, appreciation of, as you said, he is one of the, greatest molecular biologists of all time. And him having, just going out of his way to comment itself is a recognition.
But he also praised my work, so he said, it's beautiful work, fantastic. But, you should forget about Stockholm. I mean, it was sort of a weird conversation. But it's not the worst thing he said, right? I mean, he said some very outrageous and really obnoxious things. So on a scale of Watson comments, it was really not a big deal.
All right, got it. Okay, all right. It is what it is, a small thing. But did things completely change for it? Must be quite a thing, after you got the call in, I guess, 2008.
The problem is that within your field, you're already quite well known by the time you get a Nobel Prize. You've received all sorts of other kinds of recognition, like election to various societies. And even, I should say, the Indian National Science Academy elected me a foreign fellow before that. What happens is that the public, though, hasn't heard of you. And what the Nobel does is it gives you that broader recognition, which is good and bad in the sense it gives you a kind of credibility that you could use for good purposes. But it's also bad in that it's distracting. It can go to your head. You can start mouthing off on all sorts of topics where you really have no expertise. And you have a platform. And so I think it's it's something of a mixed blessing. But if you're very careful about how you deal with it, then of course it's a wonderful thing to be acknowledged, and it's also a recognition of all the people who worked with you, all the students and postdocs who really helped make it happen. So really, it's an acknowledgement of that and of the field. It's also, all the dozens and really hundreds of people in that field who brought it to a stage where you could make your contribution. So you can't underestimate, what it takes to make a contribution. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because other people have laid the groundwork for you to be able to say, oh, now this is possible.
Right. And just to close the loop on your work on ribosomes. So after you figured out the structure, and last 20-25 years, and I'm guessing people would have built up on top of that understanding of ribosome and the role it plays, and just where are we today in terms of understanding practical applications of that side?
For a long time, it was about ribosome mechanisms. So the first structure, even the structure, so it was solved with the 30S and the 50S was solved separately initially. And then the whole thing was solved first at low resolution, and then a few years later in atomic detail. And so that's just the initial structure. So it's like understanding a machine. If you only see the machine in one state, you're not necessarily going to understand how this machine works. But if you see it moving and actually going through its various steps, you can say, oh, now I sort of see how this machine works. And so the idea was to trap the ribosome in different stages of its functioning and try to understand, how does it get started? How does it bring in the tRNA? How does it recognize the code? How does it stitch together the amino acids to make the protein? How does it terminate when it gets to the other end? So all these things took a long time. And so I would say the next 10 or 15 years were really about these mechanistic questions, and also how do antibiotics bind to the ribosome and how do they inhibit the ribosome? That was a very important question. So, but now the field has changed. It's now more about how are ribosomes regulated, because a cell has very sophisticated mechanisms to either turn on protein synthesis or to shut down protein synthesis. And this involves often interacting with the ribosome. And so a lot of the focus now is about the regulation of the process and the control of the process, and also how viruses will hijack the protein synthesis machinery and divert the ribosome to making their own genes, gene products, their own proteins. And another is about how these things go wrong in various diseases. And finally, how are ribosomes assembled and what controls the synthesis of ribosomes? Because when cells that are growing make lots of ribosomes, but you also have to degrade ribosomes. So that whole process of synthesis of ribosomes and their degradation, that's another big area. So I think the focus is shifting more into sort of the general biology of protein synthesis.
So, like absolute complete, mechanistic understanding of cell is still ahead of us. I think there's a lot we know already.
There's a lot we know, but you can't predict theoretically exactly how a cell is going to evolve. And I think there's a lot to be understood in terms of all of the interactions within the cell, how they're controlled. So biology, I say the revolution in biology began maybe 120 years ago or 130 years ago with the discovery of the gene, and then the discovery of the cell and cellular components and so on. Of course, the earlier revolution was the discovery of the cell. That happened in the 1600s. So it's gone many revolutions, but the so-called genetic revolution and the revolution in chemistry and the molecular revolution, that is still going on. And I think we're not anywhere near the end of that. And of course, there are big problems like the brain and how it works and understanding that at various levels, from the molecular level all the way to the level of circuitry and psychology. I think, that's another big question.
Right. And given that there's so much we still don't fully understand, I guess, that brings me to your new book as well, about, it's titled, Why We Die. And it's, when I saw this book, Venki, initially I've been, somewhat of a health, longevity enthusiast. And I thought, okay, one more book, by very credible scientists. I'm going to find a lot of tips about, what can I do to change my lifestyle and so on. But I think the very sobering message in the book, which I found very refreshing, it is unlike any other book on longevity, because there are, I think somebody mentioned that, we are journalists or there are, researchers with their own agenda or a financial agenda, and they extrapolate and over project. But just how did you, this is both related to your area of work, because you're a molecular biologist, and a lot of work in longevity is obviously related to what's happening in the cell, but also somewhat outside area. You have not been researching aging. So what brought you to look into this area very deeply and write this book?
Well, there were lots of reasons, some positive and some negative. I think the positive reason is that humans have wondered about mortality and aging ever since we knew about our mortality. And in fact, we may be the only animal species that knows about mortality as opposed to death. I mean, even elephants know about death. They will know when one of their herd has died. So animals know about death, but I don't think they know about lifespan and the fact that all of them are going to die one day. I think that's maybe a particularly human thing. Of course, I could be mistaken, but that's at least there's no evidence that other species know about mortality. So I thought we've known about it for ever since we've been humans, but we've not been able to do anything about it. And so all our cultures have evolved as a sort of death denial exercise. All religions basically think of death as a transition to something else. And you have an immortal soul, or even your body may resurrect itself and you live on. So I think what has happened in the last 50 years is that biology has really made progress in understanding the causes of aging and how that leads to death and its relationship to lifespan. And that's one thing. The other is that societies are getting older. I think even in India, the population of older people is growing tremendously. And in the West, it's really becoming that, so that there are many more people over 60. India is relatively a young country. It has a demographic advantage in that sense, that it has more young people than the West. But in the West, because of fertility declines and increases in life expectancy, you've got this shift in the ratio of young to old people. So there's a real need to keep people healthy as they age. And so that's also led to a lot of support for research into aging, but it's also attracted lots of people, private money, into longevity companies and basically enterprises, anti-aging enterprises. And that's also led to hype. So there are people who hype the possibilities of life extension. They hype the desirability of various supplements and various other protocols. And so I wanted to take a hard look at the field and really talk about the fundamentals, which are not going to go out of date. Anything any sort of remedy that you push now is very likely to become out of date in a while. But if you talk about fundamental principles, why we age, the underlying biology, that gives you a framework to look at any new advance and understand it. And also, it gives you the tools to have a sense of is this nonsense and is this hype, or is this something that's related to the biology that I've learned. So I thought a book like that would be useful, because many books have been written, which are written by people who have vested interests. They have either one or lots of companies. They're usually pushing an agenda. They're pushing commercial things. Some books are written by people who are pushing supplements or even a program. They'll charge you, a lot for getting their advice. And I don't have any skin in the game. I mean, the only thing I care about is whether my book sells or not. That's a different thing. And so I thought it'd be a good way, and I can afford to be honest at my stage, since I don't have any stake.
No, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, right? Because there is really, we're not talking about that it's lifespan is going to increase to 120 or 150, or the people who are going to be immortal are already born, and all those kind of messages which are getting a lot of attention on the internet. Just I think few takeaways for me from the book, Venki, is one is while the lifespan around the world has increased, but the maximum lifespan is not increased, kind of stuck in that 100 to 110 mark, and you comment on that.
Yeah.
Second thing you talk about, this while these hallmarks of aging are fairly well understood, but they are understood to the level that they're interesting, but not the level where we know we can do something with those, at least not in humans, to change things.
Yeah, I wouldn't completely agree with that. I would say the hallmarks of aging are becoming better understood, and the underlying processes are becoming better understood. And out of that are emerging strategies. There are at least 4 or 5 strategies which could help with tackling some of the symptoms of aging and improving our health as we age. So I think we're not there yet, but there are animal studies which are promising. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that if you have an anti-aging medicine, the bar is higher, because it's not about a disease that's going to kill you and therefore you're going to take it. For example, a lot of cancer treatment is highly toxic. Okay, but we take it because A, it's short term, and B, it's going to save our lives, and so we don't care about the side effects. But if you're taking something that might give you 10 extra years at the end of your life, and you have to take it for 30 years, the bar for safety and side effects is much higher. And so I think this is something the anti-aging community has to come to grips with.
So is it fair to say, based on what we understand about these aging mechanism, we probably better understand why various lifestyle interventions are effective, whether it's fasting or exercise or sleep?
I think that's one of the more interesting things that has come out, is that many of the things that we thought of as common sense, not all of it, some of it turns out to be nonsense, but some of it turns out to be very, very grounded in scientific processes. For example, that's the idea that you shouldn't overeat, and you should, have a moderate diet and try and restrict your weight. It turns out all sorts of biological processes involved in aging are actually improved if you don't have an all-you-can-eat diet and you restrict the number of calories that you consume. And fasting also, there's good evidence about fasting. It's a little bit controversial, because the controversy is not about whether fasting is good for you, but whether is it good because it reduces the number of calories, or is it good separately from the caloric restriction? That's not entirely clear, because some people say, well, fasting is simply a way to consume fewer calories, because if you fast, then overall you're consuming fewer calories. So I think that's the disagreement, but there's no question that a good diet is one component. Then exercise is an amazingly useful intervention against for all sorts of health, including aging, because it triggers many of our regenerative mechanisms, which regenerate tissues, even organelles like mitochondria, which are essential in all cells. And then people have underestimated the importance of sleep. But sleep, it turns out, is involved in maintenance and repair, all the way from the molecular to the cellular level. And so it turns out that people who are sleep deprived are at risk for all sorts of diseases, and including accelerated aging. So I would say these are some of the interventions you can do. There are other things you can do that will help. For example, you can go and get a checkup and make sure your blood pressure is normal and well controlled. And you can make sure that your cholesterol and lipids are controlled. And you can also make sure that you're not diabetic. And if you are, you get that treated. Those are also interventions that will allow you to stay healthier as you age.
And with these interventions, one of the concept we talk about is this whole idea of morbidity compression, which is that you can improve your lifespan so that the time you suffer or be declining can be just few years whenever 80s or 90s, but you can have fully healthy life for most of your time you are alive.
Yeah, this whole idea of compression or morbidity assumes that your lifespan is fixed. Okay, there's an upper limit to your lifespan, and that as you improve your health, then the fraction of time that you're spending in poor health is getting shorter and shorter. So you're healthy, and then you go through a rapid decline. Now, of course, in the past, all improvements in health have also resulted in extension of longevity, of life expectancy. So I'm not completely convinced that this compression of morbidity is achievable, although there are people who feel that upper lifespan is fixed and will compress on morbidity. But my feeling is if everything is working and you're healthy, why are you suddenly going to drop dead? It doesn't really quite make sense. And of course, if they find out why, maybe it's some factor like frailty, then people will start working on that, and then they'll try to eliminate that cause. So I think it's a complicated question, and I discuss the pros and cons of the debate in my book.
Got it. And this idea of the fixed lifespan. So from science point of view, what's the best current understanding? In the book you talk about there's so many species, like bowhead whales, could live up to 400 years, and this Galapagos, tortoise for 150 years or so. But humans, we have so far seen no evidence of upper end of the lifespan increasing. Today, we should just keep our eyes and ears open and be optimistic about some breakthroughs in coming decades.
I think the general feeling, the reason species have different lifespans is because evolution selected each species to optimize fitness, which is the ability to pass on your genes. Okay, so if you're a small animal or an insect, there's no reason to live very long because you're going to be eaten by a predator, or you're going to die of starvation or heat or drought or whatever. You're going to die of other causes long before you become old. And so there's no reason for evolution to select for genes that do a lot of maintenance and repair. Instead, it has selected for genes that accelerate growth and maturity and fecundity, ability to produce lots of offspring. And of course, if you're a bigger animal, then the equation changes. And it is worth living longer because you can produce offspring over a longer life and so on. So whatever the reason, our lifespan has given our natural biology seems to sort of max out at about 110 or so. But there's no physical law that this is simply the way evolution has selected for our genetics, and which has resulted in our particular biology. But if you understand the processes of aging and you can do something about it, then it may be possible to break that. But so there's no physical or chemical law. Whales and tortoises are also made of the same material, DNA and proteins and so on. But having said that, just because there's no physical or chemical law against it, it doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. There's no physical or chemical law that says we can't colonize other galaxies or even Mars. Okay, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. Yeah, because in practice it's quite hard. So I think we need fundamental breakthroughs in the aging field before that can be pushed. But it may happen. There's so much being invested in anti-aging research that it may happen. I would hesitate to put a time scale on it, but I think it's harder. I think it's much harder than people think, because aging is a highly complex phenomenon that involves aging at every level, from the molecular to the intracellular, to the cellular, to the tissue and organismic levels. And all these levels interact with each other. So I don't think it's going to be so straightforward to have a whole organism age healthily and remain healthy, indefinitely or for a very long time.
Got it. So for people who are interested in this area, they can be cautiously optimistic, but also patient and wait for those breakthroughs. And you mentioned,
I think this is true of any new technology. What happens? We saw that with the internet. We're seeing that with AI. There's initially a huge amount of hype. Then there's some disappointment. Nothing happens, and then eventually it really does take off.
Right.
And I think that's sort of this sort of, what is it called? A winter of discontent. That's true of all these new technologies. Initial hype, and then there's a winter of discontent, and then followed by the real, development. So that may well happen with age.
Right. So, Venki, my last question to you is, in preparation of this book, went through, I think you mentioned there are something like 300,000 papers have been published in just last 10 years alone.
Yeah. I can't pretend to have read even a tiny fraction of those. Okay.
Right. But you did, you probably read more than, most of us ever will. And somewhere, you would have, and you obviously know a lot of people in this area, you would have, talked to some people and so on. Are there things that you are able to take it from all that, reading, researching to your own life, you're saying, okay, this is what I want to change?
No, not really. I've not been tempted to take any of these supplements because I'd rather, some of them do have actual drawbacks, but even some which don't, I think, one ought to wait for some proper trials. However, in terms of lifestyle, there's not a lot I can do. I mean, I try not to overeat, although I have a fondness for desserts and things like that. But and I maintain quite an active lifestyle. I don't own a car. I bicycle to work. I go on walks and go to the gym regularly and so on. So I do the things that are recommended anyway. So I'm not sure what else I can do. And I just try not to worry about it. I think it's more important to enjoy your life. I think some people get obsessed with longevity. And I've heard that among the upper middle class and wealthy people in India, it has also become an obsession, sort of like the West. I think, this is simply all the trends in the West eventually are copied in India. I think it's terrible. India has a philosophy of its own and everything. Instead of that, they're aping all these, silly fads in the West. And anyway, so these people are obsessed with longevity. And I would say to them, just relax and live your life and do things that are interesting. And, don't worry about it. So
I won't disagree with you at all. I think there is a lot of interest, and because a lot of these promises, and because of internet, social media, people like Brian Johnson, everyone sees what's happening and all that, and people without grounding in science, people believe that maybe we are on the verge of breakthrough, maybe there is this magic potion, or magic pill, or
yeah. But people have been looking for that. I write about the Emperor Qin, who was the first person to unify China. So China is actually in a way named after Qin, I guess. But anyway, this guy was obsessed about dying. He used to look for all sorts of potions that would help him live longer. And he died in his 40s. Actually, some of the potions had mercury, and he may have actually shortened his life by taking them. So this is not new. Our obsession with mortality, it's a very old story. I mean, even the pharaohs in Egypt, they were mummified, and the idea was eventually they would come alive again at some point. This is just a human obsession.
Yeah, and I said last question, but since you mentioned, that in India, we have very rich tradition of, breaking down life into the 4 stages and be at peace with, each stage of life and so on. Yeah. And I think last couple of chapters of your book also, fairly philosophical, almost thinking about, whatever number of years I have, what is the meaning and purpose of that, what is the fulfilling life, and kind of it comes with versus chasing a chimera, which is not going to happen. and he was fighting against, the grain. That maybe his last word on, how he thought about this.
Absolutely. I think, part of I think our mortality gives us a drive to make the most of our lives. And if we didn't have that, if we had a very long life, we would simply, I'm not sure, we'd just stretch it out. I'm not sure we would actually do that much more. And I also think, philosophically, you just have to get used to the idea. Of course, we're programmed to want to live. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think a lot of the obsession comes out of that instinct to live.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a good food for thought. Venki, I want to thank you for, first of all, writing both the books, especially the latest one. I think, given so much noise and hype, I think this will give people, really solid grounding on what's real, what's not real. But also, so thanks for being so generous with your time.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Venki.
Thank you. Bye.
At Sparks, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to Sparks on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.